Hello and welcome to Faircom Limited, Register Trademark. My name is Lysion.
And my name is Ray.
And today we're going to talk about different shell types in War Thunder ground forces. So we're going to focus on tanks especially. No aviation ammo is handled here.
Okay, first of all, the type is differs from the name of the shells. For example, the German Panzergranate 40, and yes, I say the German because we are German people, is from type APCR, and the Russian BR-243P is also type APCR. So keep that in mind that we talk about the type, and the type is always displayed under the name of the shell, so don't worry about that. Next one is we want to talk short about normalization because we use this word relatively often in this video. Normalization, what is it? The shape of the shell and other modifications improve the angle of impact. For example, if we have a ballistic cap, the angle of impact should be increased. The shell hits the armor and the angle at an angle of round about 50 degrees. The ballistic cap cramps and improves the angle. Now the core round hits with 55 degrees. So you have more chance of penetration and less chance of a ricochet. Yeah, that's basically normalization.
Yeah, and what should be added here is that we always want 90 degrees of impact, because that's when your shell hits flat on the enemy target. Just to give you a overview what those numbers mean. So everything close to 90 degree is generally perfect. So from 50 to 55, this is definitely an improvement. So let's start with the AP shell right now. The AP, or simply armor piercing shell, is the most basic that you will find in War Thunder. It is just a metal lump which is shot against the enemy armor. The AP shell mostly consists of varying steels, and on the top of it you have a hardened steel, a harder alloy, which is basically to withstand the impact itself and to allow penetration. There are two main sources of damage to be caused by an armor-piercing round. The first one is spalling. Spalling might occur even if the shell does not penetrate, so it is not dependent on penetration entirely. Spalling is when there are some shrapnel or some parts are just getting loose on the inside of the enemy armor. And of course you have more spalling when the shell actually penetrates, but even if it does not, spalling can happen. The second source of damage is fragmentation. Fragmentation is of two sources. First of all, when the shell goes through the enemy armor, the material of armor does not simply disappear. It is going to be stamped into the tank and also fragments due to the high impact force. And the shell itself could fragment as well, but it does not necessarily have to. The spall and the fragmentation is causing damage inside the enemy armor by killing crew or just damaging internal parts. As an addition to the armor-piercing shell, there is the APC shell, which stands for armor-piercing capped. It is a simple AP round with a cap added on top of it. The cap has just one task. It takes the initial shock when the shell hits the enemy armor, because you have learned in physics, when there is a force applied, then there is a equal counterforce applied in the opposite direction. So when the shell hits the enemy armor, then it gets its own force back, and it has to withstand its own force, and this is called initial shock. And to distribute the energy of the shock a lot better, there is a cap of soft metal which is deforming instead of breaking, because a hardened top of a regular AP shell would be more prone to break instead of deform. And also this armor-piercing cap is giving you a little better normalization because it cramps up and gives a more flat surface for the armor-piercing shell to penetrate. Then you have the armor-piercing ballistic cap, or APBC. The ballistic cap is made of fragile material on top of the regular AP round. It only improves the aerodynamics, so this means increased speed and increased penetration potential. it does not take a lot of initial shock, and it also does not cramp up because it's fragile, so it does not help with normalization that much, just a little bit. And it does not decrease the penetration potential at all, it increases it by increasing speed. As a combination of the cap and the ballistic cap, you have the APCBC round, which stands for armor piercing capped ballistic cap. It's just a regular AP shell with both caps added on it, because a cap to absorb shock is not aerodynamically shaped, and that's why you need both caps on top of it, and you can't just go with one of them. The APCBC shell is the shell you want to go for because it's the best when it comes down to aerodynamics and normalization values, so it has the best penetration capabilities. With this being said, I now give up to the next part, which is handled by Ray.
Yes, now we come to the fun part, the boomy part. First of all, the HE, which stands for high explosive. These shells have no direct armor penetration due to kinetic energy. And they are primarily not developed for tank destroying, but they can damage the tracks or periscopes, basically all ribs attachments on the armor. But if the caliber is large enough, tanks could also be destroyed. And that's the reason why mostly Russians used the HE shells for tank destruction. Because of their 152mm guns and things like this. And the ridiculous big guns of the Russians.
Because larger shell means larger boom.
Yes. As a little trivia fact, don't know if it's trivia, but it is. Most explosives are RDX based, so the charges are RDX based. Okay, next one is the APHE. It's basically an armor penetrating shot with a high explosive filler. It has a delayed fuse, so it ensures that the filler goes off inside the tank and not outside, so first comes the penetration and then comes the boom. With this you have more fragmentation and an increased damage potential. And these shells have in general the highest damage potential in War Thunder. When they hit and when they penetrate, they make the best damage you can get. But the penetration potential is a little bit decreased in compared to a normal AP shell, because the shell is a little bit lighter. You don't have, I don't know, but I think you don't have the APHE in general. Most of the time they are combined with something like APHE BC or something like this. I don't know, but there is no APHE in general, I think.
It might be generally the APHE can come up with every edition like a regular AP shell, so there might be APHE, APHE BC, and everything that applies to an AP shell could be applied to an APHE as well.
Yeah, if we don't cover every combination you can basically think of what it means, because we explained the modifications here. Okay, the Shrapnel shell. This is basically an HE charge in the back of the shell and small lead pellets in the middle and the front. It's sealed on the top with a delayed fuse. And on hit, the fuse is activated, and after penetration, the charge explodes. So the shrapnel pellets kill the crew and damage the components, because they go all around in the tank. Which is not very funny for the crew, I think. Yeah, it's mostly used against soft targets or smaller tanks. And was lesser used in tanks, but more in artillery, mortar or shotguns, and as anti-personnel shells. And here, again, as a little trivia, it's invented by a British officer named Henry Shrapnel in '83, and there comes the name Shrapnel.
Well, with this being said, let's head on to the next shell, which is the APCR or HVAP, which is basically the same thing. APCR is the more common term, that's why I'm going to use it here for explanation. It stands for Armor Piercing Composite Rigid. The HVAP or High Velocity Armor Piercing is the term used by the US military, but everything else uses APCR. It's a hardcore round encased with a softer hull. We looked for a better translation, but it's actually just given as a hard can because I think it was invented and mostly used by Germans in World War II. And so we found no better translation than hardcore. The hardcore is mostly consistent of tungsten carbide. Today we use depleted uranium because we have it in advance. What you get out of your regular reactor would be depleted uranium. That's why you're going to use that, because otherwise it's just simply trash. And yeah, the hull is made of softer materials or softer alloys, mostly of aluminum. The case or outside the hardcore is to first take the initial shock, and second to cramp up on the enemy armor and allow the hardcore to hit the enemy armor with high speed. Also, APCR shells are very aerodynamic. That's why they give a lot of penetration potential, but also they provide a very limited amount of damage potential because the solid core of tungsten carbide is not very prone to break. It mostly stays intact after penetrating, so you have less spalling and less fragmentation after penetration. So that's why you use APCR against harder targets, but not if you want to do some damage. Well, but sometimes you need something different than APCR, because sometimes the enemy armor is very angled or the enemy target is very far away, and that's when you come up with the heat shell, high explosive anti-tank. But it does not combine the effects of the HE shell with an AP shell. It is something completely different. The HE shell has a large charge in the back of the shell and a hollow copper cone in front of the shell. When the HE charge explodes, then the copper is accelerated to the front and the center of the shell to a very small hole. When it passes through this small hole, it gets accelerated even more, and it forms a very fast copper stream. This copper stream is going to penetrate the enemy armor with high speed, and it's even above sonic speed. The penetration does not occur through the heat, but the speed of the stream itself, because some people claim that the penetration goes because the copper melts through the enemy armor, but this is plain wrong, because during penetration the copper reaches temperatures around 400 Celsius degrees, and that's not enough to melt copper. But through the friction that is caused by penetration, the copper might melt down after penetration, but not during the process of penetration. So we have a kinetic energy penetration here. But the heat shell itself is not a kinetic energy penetrator, because it's not relying on the mass of the shell. Well, a little bit probably, because a larger shell means you have a larger charge, which allows more penetration, but it's not reliant on the mass itself, just on the size probably, and it's not relying on speed, because it does not matter with which speed the heat shell hits. That's why it's irrelevant on which distance you shoot it. It will always provide the same penetration values, and it has a very good normalization. That's why it's very effective against angled armor. With this being said, I give the next part to Ray.
Yes, one thing for heat, before I continue, just because it's high explosive, or it looks a little bit more boomy, it doesn't mean that it makes a very high damage in the tank or on the crew. It's basically very precise, so if you hit a tank with a heat, you damage the module or the crew behind that point. So there is not very much boom into the tank.
Yeah, because you have no spalling or fragmentation caused by a heat shell.
Yes, I just want to make it clear, because that's something that, especially I thought at the beginning of my War Thunder career does not exist. Okay, but let's continue. With APDS, this stands for Armor Piercing Discarding Sabo, aka Subcaliber rounds. This is a regular AP core encased by a Sabo. The round is smaller in diameter than the gun barrel, so it's subcaliber. And after leaving the barrel, the Sabo falls off, so it's discarding. yeah, with this you can combine the power of a larger caliber with the aerodynamics of a smaller round. So you have a higher velocity and higher damage potential. Higher penetration potential, sorry. Penetration. You see it on the screen on an example of an APDS round. It's ridiculous high, the penetration potential in numbers.
So let's get to the last shell type that we are going to cover here. It is the hash shell. This stands for High Explosive Squash Head. There also exists the AC shell, the anti-concrete shell, which operates in a similar way, but as far as I'm concerned, the KV-2 is the only tank in game which uses AC shells, so we're not going to go for that one special. Let's stick with the hash shell, which is more common throughout later tiers of War Thunder. There are some similarities to the heat shells, but the hash shell works in a completely different way. You also have a very large explosive charge, but this time it is of plastic explosives, which cramp up on the enemy armor on impact. And after the plastic explosive is cramped up, a fuse sets it off, and this generates a huge shockwave, which is going through the enemy tank. And there are two sources of damage. First one is the shockwave itself, because if you are hit in the face by a sledgehammer, that's not very pleasant. And this is what the tank feels like when it's hit by a squash head. And this might cause some modules to simply fail, like the engine, which is disturbed in its regular operation. So engine fails are very likely, but in War Thunder there is no such thing, so don't count on that. And yeah, the second one is spalling, because when this shockwave goes through the enemy armor, then it's not penetrating the armor itself, but it causes, let's say, vibration, and this causes some fragments on the interior hull side to fall off, and this spall is going to fly around in the enemy tank and causing severe damage here. Hash shells are quite efficient against angled armor because it really doesn't matter in which angle it hits. It will always have the same, let's say, penetration potential. Well, it does not actually penetrate, so it will always have the same, let's say, damage effect. It will always be able to destroy an enemy tank with 150mm of armor, no matter how this armor is shaped or angled. It's very efficient against Soviet tanks, especially the post-war tanks like the T-54 or the T-10. So this might be a shell that should be interesting for you if you're playing with the Leopard or the Chieftain, for example. As a little trivia, the hash shell is or was used only for a very limited period of time because of new armor types like composite armor or Kevlar casing on the inside, which made hash shells completely obsolete very quickly because they were invented post-war and used throughout the 60s and 70s, but then they become rapidly obsolete.
Okay, let's go to the last one, which is not, a shell type in general, but a modification. The EFS, the fin stabilized. Basically, you put on the back of the round some fins for better aerodynamics, and as said, this can be used, I put some images on the screen right now, this can be used on, basically I would say nearly any kind of shell, for example, Heat FS or APDS FS. So it's just a little modification to ensure or to improve the aerodynamics.
Yeah, basically only important for the T-62 tank, because every tank in War Thunder has a rifled barrel, except the T-62, which comes up with a smoothbore barrel. And when you have a rifled barrel, you add some spinning to the projectile, which stabilizes it in flight. But when you have a smoothbore barrel, you have no rifles on the inside of your barrel, so you have no spin stabilization, and that's when you need the fin stabilization, and that's what it was invented for. And that's basically it.
Before we end off the video, just want to say you now have the basics and how the shells work, but we don't talk too much about where to use it at best. That's because that's a little bit thinking you have to do on your own. For example, for a ridiculous example, if you have a Tiger 1 before you, you don't want to shoot at him with a shrapnel. You want to use an APCR or something like this. And if you see an SPAA, you want to shoot at him with a shrapnel because the damage potential is, ridiculously high. So, yeah, that's just before we ending the video. You have to do a little bit of thinking on your own.
Well, that's it then. I hope you enjoyed our video. I hope it helped you a little bit to understand how shells work in War Thunder and also a little bit how to use them. And with this being said, that's everything. Hope we see you in our next video. Bye bye.
Bye.